Content warning. Check the show notes for more information. It's Halloween. Oh! And another remarkable event is about to be uncovered by Arion, Rebecca, and Olly, the Retrospectors.
Although Casanova is best remembered as a womanizing Lothario, he also had a degree in law and dabbled in medicine, and over the course of his quite extraordinary life he could also lay claim to being a cleric and a soldier, a playwright and a violinist, a conman and a gambler, and today in history, a prison escapee.
Yeah, this is one of the most daring and haphazard, farcical prison breaks in all recorded history. But I suppose, like so much in Casanova's life, there are certainly some grey areas, I'm sure we'll come to that. He comes out in his lifetime as the winner, because ultimately he did break out of the Doge's palace in Venice during the Inquisition. And aside from his accomplice, as far as I'm aware, is the only person documented to have ever done that.
So he'd been sentenced to 5 years in the Leads, as it was called, and it was this wing of 8 cells in the palace itself, although obviously not near any of the important people partying and living the palace lifestyle. It was used to hold prisoners who were high status or politically thorny in some way, and it was named because it was below the lead roof of the palace. Casanova wasn't particularly thrilled with the facilities; they were fairly basic. He had,
although these days, if you got to stay in the roof of a palace in Venice on Airbnb, you'd be happy, wouldn't you?
I think the view must have been good. The view was good, but inside it was just a straw pallet to sleep on. He also had an armchair, which proved really vital to the escape because he was allowed to go into the attic on, just a little walk, stretch his legs. He obviously wasn't being monitored very closely because on these walks he found a piece of stone and an iron bar. I'm like, well, that's the last thing you want to leave lying around in your prison exercise attic. Anyway, but he was able to conceal these within the armchair. I don't think prisoners should have upholstered furniture for this reason. And he used the stone to strike against the iron bar and turn it into a stake to bore a hole, initially in the floor. And he'd almost finished this whole escape plan, and then he was abruptly moved to a better cell. He had been upgraded, so I guess he had to act like he was really happy about it, but he had almost finished breaking out of the first one.
It's so funny because apparently his jailer, who was by all reports a very nice and cheery man, and by all reports I mean Casanova's book, so he's
only from which we know pretty much everything and all we know about Casanova.
Right, so even though history does support the idea that he did go to prison and then break out of prison, probably a lot of the detail of it is, it's given an extra level of excitement thanks to the fact that its author was the person doing the jailbreaking. But anyway, so his jailer came to him and said he was really happy to be moving him because one of his benefactors had arranged for him to get some slightly better conditions.
And to be fair, he'd only been imprisoned for being irreligious and possibly writing a poem. So, being locked up for 15 months already was quite a harsh punishment.
And really, primarily, according to the tribunal that found him guilty and sent him to prison, it was for public outrages against the holy religion, and specifically they were worried about him being dangerous for social stability, so the case against him was relatively slight. In any case, as he got moved, his jailers found the hole that he had just finished making. Apparently, he was 1 hour away from executing his escape plan when they moved him to a different cell. But they didn't, crucially, find the whetstone and the iron bar that he'd been using to make the hole, and they stayed secured in his armchair.
So then he enlists the help of a monk who is also imprisoned like himself, and the monk agreed to join Casanova and aid with the escape, but only after making Casanova promise that he had a solid plan for breaking out. And I think this speaks to Casanova's skills, both with the ladies, which is why he's famous, but also actually with all the gentlemen in Venice, which is how he'd managed to climb his way through society from relatively humble origins. He was a con man. He used a lot of cheek, he used a lot of mischief, he used a lot of chutzpah, he said what he needed to at the moment. Imagine Boris Johnson, but thinner in Italian, right? And he says to this monk, yes, I've got a complete plan for escaping, you can trust me, let's escape together. And over several hard months, he and the monk laboriously dig a hole from inside their cell and then climb out to freedom, and then on the roof Of the palace, he turns around and says, actually, sorry, I haven't got a plan now. I don't know how to get down from here.
Just before we get to the rooftop, I just have to give one detail of the story, which is so incredibly Italian. So the way that Casanova got the bar to this priest, Father Balbi, is that he transferred it to him by cooking a huge dish of macaroni and Parmesan cheese, which had this butter that was swimming up to the rim of the of the dish. And then he put the bar into a huge Bible and then put the dish on the Bible and gave both to his jailer and told him that he had to be very careful not to spill the cheese and the butter onto the expensive Bible as he carried it to his friend. And so the jailer was like concentrating on that rather than the fact that he was carrying...
The jailer was like, well, can't I just hold one thing in each hand? And Casanova was like, no questions.
You're wrong. The most Italian part of the escape was the nap that he took in the library midway through the escapade so that he could figure out the next phase.
Yeah, so they got onto the roof and they didn't have a way of getting down, but they did have a sheet with a knot in it. But obviously they are on the roof of the palace, so that's not going to get you to the ground. So instead they smashed a dormer window and they lowered themselves down on the sheep rope, and they were just in some random room of the palace then. So then they took a nap, and then the next morning they just did a sitcom B plot basically where they pretended that they were guests who'd accidentally been locked in after a party the night before, and people just waved them through. I mean, there were only 8 cells. You'd think that the staff would learn to recognise who the 8 prisoners were, precisely to avoid a situation like this.
Also then, the fact that they got onto a gondola at sunrise. I mean, this has now got to be artistic embellishment. But at least according to Casanova, thus did God provide me with what I needed for an escape, which was to be a wonder, if not a miracle. I admit that I am proud of it. He's proud of quite a lot of his exploits, let's face it, in the course of his life. But this one was remarkable.
But also, he's nostalgic about a lot of his exploits. And he's nostalgic because we know about these experiences because of his infamous memoir, The Story of My Life, 3,000 pages long, written in his 60s. And the narrative stops before he becomes an older man. It's all about the virility and the escapades and exploits of youth. And so it is the work of a 60-year-old kind of failed writer. People have forgotten he'd written loads of other stuff. He wrote a 5-volume work of science fiction set in the interior of the Earth. He wrote a whole load of stuff that no one was bothered to read.
The publisher was like, could you put like 300 more sexual encounters in
Yeah, exactly.
Can this future guy be shagging more people?
And this was him trying his hand at Bonkbuster.
And in the final years of his life, he'd fallen on hard times. He had a real boom and bust approach to his lifestyle. You know, at this point, at the end, he was in a bust phase. He was ridden with syphilis and probably all of the other sexually transmitted diseases under the sun. And he was working this remote castle in Bohemia as a librarian to a lord. So his life was really on the downswing. He didn't speak German. Nobody there liked him. So he's sitting there at the desk, and now picture, you know, he's going back in time, like a funky jazz version of Girl from Ipanema is playing, and he's going back to his early days because he was born in Venice, which was the swingingest place to be in Europe at the time.
It's like the Las Vegas of Europe, wasn't it?
Yeah.
Gambling.
Yeah, well, it was, I mean, for one thing, there was the Venice Carnival, which at the time was a byword for revelry. And then his parents were Bohemian actors, which was setting the scene for his own life, which was obviously very theatrical, but he didn't see much of them. Looking at his early years, a modern psychological reading might suggest the origin point for his need to constantly be shagging, which was that he was raised by his grandmother because his parents were always away touring with their theatre troupe, and then she sent him to boarding school supposedly for his health, but he wrote later that he thought it was to get rid of him. So he had a big emotional void and lots of feelings of abandonment. But we're in 18th century Venice, so don't worry about that. It probably doesn't mean anything.
Well, he filled that void by, well, 2 things.
By filling voids.
Yeah, well, that's what happened. So first of all, he entered the University of Padua at the age of 12. So he was incredibly sharp, even from a very young age. But then the other way that he found to make himself happier was to have a lot of sex. And his first sexual encounter was with not just one, but 2 sisters who he slept with at the same time, which, if that wasn't sort of peculiar enough, he later wound up in bed with one of the 2 again, and her daughter, who was also his own daughter.
No!
Yes. So it...
Although he said that he didn't have sex with her. He said he left her intact, quote.
I think that's to be admired, Olly.
Yeah, I think very generous to Casanova.
So to apply modern filters onto this, you know, people now have uncovered what we would now think of as rape and even murder, actually. In one case from his story, which at the time were seen completely as jolly japes from his life story, although it is worth putting it in the context of a time when it wasn't unusual to have a sex worker who was 14 years old or to marry a 13-year-old. That's the sort of thing that was happening commonplace. So that doesn't mark him out in and of itself. But obviously his attitude to women can now seem to be, let's be honest, pretty disposable. But, it is interesting to note that he did seem to care what people thought of him, and that included the women that he slept with. He didn't want to hurt anybody.
No.
Apart from the person he murdered.
Tomorrow.
And many presidents, have actually left the White House in really, really serious debt, including Bill Clinton.
Ditch the ads and get a Sunday episode when you join Club Retrospectors. Subscribe now on Apple Podcasts, part of the Acast Creator Network.